The last one rolled off the line on a Friday, December 20th, 1963, South Bend, Indiana. The temperature outside the Studebaker plant had dropped below freezing, but inside, the factory floor was warm from decades of heat, the accumulated breath of men who had spent their lives building something they believed in. The car was a Studebaker cruiser, dark, understated, assembled by hands that had done this 10,000 times before. When it reached the end of the line, no one cheered. No executive stepped forward to shake hands or give a speech. There were no cameras from the major networks, no delegation from Washington, no ceremony of any kind. A foreman signed a form. Someone turned off a machine. And just like that, 112 years of American manufacturing history came to an end in a factory that smelled like oil and metal and everything this country used to make with its hands. The workers knew before the announcement came. They always do. You can feel a company dying the way you can feel a change in weather. Something shifts in the air, in the way management walks through the floor without making eye contact, in the meetings that happen behind closed doors and produce nothing. By the time the Studebaker Corporation made it official, the men on that South Bend line had already been grieving for months. What they hadn't been told, what the board had been careful never to say out loud, was that the decision had been made long before December. The closure of the South Bend plant had been signed, sealed, and settled in boardrooms far removed from the factory floor. The men who made that decision did not work on the line. Most of them had never built a car with their hands in their lives. They had, however, destroyed one with their signatures. Here is what the obituaries got wrong about Studebaker. They blamed the market. They blamed General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, the big three whose shadow fell over every independent automaker in post-war America. They blamed the economy, the unions, the changing tastes of the American consumer. They constructed a tidy narrative about a small company that simply couldn't compete, a noble but inevitable casualty of industrial consolidation. That narrative is a lie. Studebaker did not die because it was too small. It had survived the Great Depression. It had outlasted dozens of competitors. It had navigated the transition from horse-drawn wagons to combustion engines when nearly every other carriage maker in America had been buried by that shift. It had produced some of the most celebrated automobile designs of the 20th century. It had, at its peak, been one of the most admired manufacturing companies in the world. Studebaker died because of specific decisions made by specific people for specific reasons. Some of those reasons were fear, some were arrogance, some were greed, and some, the ones that sting the most, were simple, catastrophic incompetence dressed up in the language of corporate strategy. This is the story of how America's oldest family car empire was brought down not by the market, not by history, not by forces beyond anyone's control, but by the men trusted to protect it. Some of them inherited that trust. Some of them seized it. All of them failed it. By the time you reach the end of this story, you will understand exactly what happened inside those boardrooms, inside that factory, inside a dynasty that began with 5 brothers, $68, and a blacksmith's forge in the Indiana wilderness. You will understand what was lost. And you will understand, with a clarity that is equal parts fury and grief, precisely who lost it. The last Studebaker sat at the end of the line. Nobody took a photograph. In 1736, a German Reformed minister named Johann Studebaker crossed the Atlantic Ocean with his family and nothing else worth counting. He settled in Pennsylvania, learned English badly, and taught his sons to work metal. His sons taught their sons. His grandsons taught their grandsons. For 4 generations, the Studebaker family made things with their hands in the Pennsylvania backcountry, moving slowly westward as America itself moved westward, following the frontier the way water follows a slope. By 1850, the family had reached Ohio. By 1851, 2 of them had reached Indiana. Henry and Clement Studebaker arrived in South Bend with $68 between them and a skill that the American frontier needed more than almost any other. They could build wagons. Not decorative wagons, not gentlemen's carriages, working wagons. Heavy, reliable, load-bearing wagons built for roads that were barely roads, for distances that broke lesser vehicles, for a country that was still in the process of inventing itself. They rented a 2-room blacksmith shop on Michigan Street. They bought 2 forges, a set of tools, and enough raw materials to begin. Henry handled the business. Clement worked the iron. In their first year, they grossed $1,800. They reinvested everything. They hired 1 man, then 2, then 5. They moved to a larger shop. They moved again. 3 more brothers followed. John, Peter, and Jacob arrived from Ohio and folded themselves into the operation with the particular efficiency of men who had grown up understanding that a family either worked together or fell apart. The 5 Studebaker brothers ran their company the way a healthy family runs a household, with disagreement, with negotiation, with the kind of fierce loyalty that comes not from sentiment but from shared stakes. What they built in that South Bend shop in the 1850s was not yet an empire. It was a reputation. Then came the war. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the United States Army needed wagons the way it needed rifles and boots and men, desperately, immediately, in quantities that no single supplier had ever been asked to meet. The Studebaker brothers submitted a bid. They won a contract. And then they did something that separated them from every competitor who had also won contracts. They delivered exactly what they promised, on time, at the quality they had specified. In an era when government contracting was synonymous with fraud, with shoddy goods and inflated invoices and materials that fell apart in the field, the Studebaker wagon became known as something different. Officers requested them by name. Quartermasters fought over allocations. Union soldiers who had ridden in other wagons and then rode in a Studebaker noticed the difference immediately. The tighter joints, the better seasoned wood, the ironwork that held under conditions that destroyed cheaper vehicles. The Army ordered more. The brothers expanded the factory. They hired more workers, installed more forges, developed more efficient production methods. By the end of the war, they were operating one of the largest wagon manufacturing facilities in the United States. Peace did not slow them down. If the Civil War had built Studebaker, westward expansion made it colossal. The Great Migration of American settlers across the plains and into the territories created a demand for wagons that dwarfed even the Army's wartime appetite. Pioneers needed vehicles that could carry an entire family's possessions across 1,000 miles of terrain that had defeated better-equipped expeditions. Studebaker became the wagon of the American West, not by accident, not by advertising, but by reputation built one delivery at a time. When settlers wrote home from Kansas or Nebraska or the Dakota Territory, they named the wagon they had trusted with their lives. The name they wrote was Studebaker. By the 1890s, the company employed over 6,000 workers. The South Bend complex had grown into a small city of its own. Foundries, lumber yards, paint shops, upholstery departments, a dedicated railroad spur that brought raw materials in and shipped finished wagons out to dealers across the continent. The Studebaker brothers had built not merely a successful business, but an institution, the kind of American manufacturing company that seemed as permanent and inevitable as the landscape it served. Henry Studebaker died in 1895. Clement followed in 1901. Peter, John, and Jacob outlived them, but the company had long since grown beyond any single brother's management. It had become something larger than a family business and smaller than a corporation, a dynasty, carrying a name that meant, to millions of Americans, something reliable, something honest, something built to last. They could not have imagined what was coming. They could not have imagined what the next century would demand of the name they had made, and they could not have imagined the men who would one day hold that name in their hands and let it fall. The automobile arrived in America the way most revolutions arrive, gradually, then all at once. In 1895, there were 4 registered motor vehicles in the United States. By 1905, there were 78,000. By 1915, there were 2.5 million. The horse-drawn vehicle did not disappear overnight. It died in stages, model year by model year, as the internal combustion engine made its case on every road in the country with an argument that was impossible to refute. It was faster, it was cheaper to operate, it did not need to be fed when it was not working. For the wagon makers of America, this was an extinction event. Companies that had spent decades perfecting the art of wooden wheels and iron axles and seasoned lumber found themselves holding expertise that the market no longer needed. One by one they closed. Some tried to pivot and failed. Some simply refused to acknowledge what was happening until the acknowledgement came too late, until the orders stopped and the workers went home and the factory doors stayed shut. Studebaker did not close. Studebaker did not refuse. Studebaker did something that required a particular kind of institutional courage. It looked directly at the thing that was coming to destroy it, and decided to become it instead. The transition was not graceful, it was not swift, and it was very nearly a catastrophe. The brothers' first experiment with automobiles came in 1897, when the company began supplying carriage bodies to early electric vehicle manufacturers. This was not yet commitment, it was curiosity, a careful toe extended into unfamiliar water. The Studebaker name went on to vehicles it had not fully built, powered by technology it did not yet control. The results were modest. The lessons were invaluable. In 1902, Studebaker produced its first electric automobile. In 1904, it produced its first gasoline-powered car, entering into a partnership with the Garford Company of Elyria, Ohio, to supply chassis while Studebaker contributed bodies and distribution. The arrangement was imperfect. Studebaker did not control its own product, and in manufacturing, control is everything. A company that depends on another company for its most critical component is not an automobile manufacturer. It is an assembler wearing an automobile manufacturer's clothes. The brothers understood this. In 1911, Studebaker dissolved the Garford partnership and purchased the Everett Metzger Flanders Company of Detroit, acquiring with it something they had been missing: complete, end-to-end control of their own automobile production. For the first time, a Studebaker car was built entirely by Studebaker hands, from raw steel to finished vehicle. What followed was not immediate triumph. The early years of independent automobile production were expensive, technically demanding, and commercially uncertain. Studebaker made mistakes. They misjudged markets, overproduced certain models, underinvested in others. The learning curve of transitioning from wagons to automobiles was steeper than anyone in South Bend had anticipated, but they stayed on the curve. By the early 1920s, Studebaker had found its footing. The company positioned itself in the middle of the American market. Not the cheapest cars, not the most expensive, but the best value at a price that an ambitious working family could reasonably consider. It was a position that required constant, disciplined execution. Too cheap and the brand lost its reputation for quality. Too expensive and it lost the volume it needed to survive against GM and Ford. Studebaker walked that line with remarkable consistency throughout the 1920s. Sales grew. The South Bend workforce expanded. The company posted profits through years when competitors were posting losses. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929 and the American automobile market collapsed, Studebaker staggered. It went through a receivership in 1933 that nearly ended everything, but it did not fall. It came back. That recovery said something important about what Studebaker had built in its first 8 decades. The bones of the company were sound. The workforce was skilled and loyal. The brand carried genuine affection in the American market, the kind of affection that is earned over generations and cannot be manufactured by an advertising campaign. What Studebaker needed now was not survival instinct. It had proven twice over that it knew how to survive. What it needed, what it was about to receive, was vision. Raymond Loewy did not look like a man who belonged in South Bend, Indiana. He was French-born, impeccably dressed, and accustomed to the company of artists, architects, and European intellectuals who regarded the American Midwest with the particular condescension of people who have never needed to make anything with their hands. He had redesigned the Coca-Cola bottle, the Lucky Strike cigarette pack, the Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive, and the interior of Air Force One. He moved between New York and Paris with the ease of a man who considered both cities merely adequate. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most influential industrial designer in the world, and in 1944, Studebaker hired him. The partnership should not have worked. Loewy's world was one of elegance and abstraction. Studebaker's world was one of production lines and quarterly sales figures and the relentless practical demands of manufacturing automobiles for middle-class American families in Indiana. The gap between these two worlds was not merely cultural, it was philosophical. What closed that gap was a shared conviction that the two things were not mutually exclusive, that a car built for a working family did not have to look like it had been designed by a committee, that beauty and affordability were not opposites, that the American consumer, given the choice between a handsome car and an ugly one at the same price, would choose the handsome one every single time. Lowy believed this with the certainty of a man who had spent his career proving it. Studebaker's leadership believed it with the desperation of a company that knew it could not outspend General Motors and needed a different kind of advantage. The result of that shared conviction arrived in showrooms in 1947. The Studebaker Starlight Coupe stopped people on the street. Not figuratively, literally. Pedestrians paused on sidewalks to look at it. Drivers slowed their own cars to examine it at traffic lights. It was unlike anything else on the American road, with a wraparound rear window that stretched across the back of the vehicle in a panoramic arc, a hood that tapered to a point, and lines that suggested motion even when the car was standing still. Automotive journalists ran out of conventional vocabulary trying to describe it. Some called it futuristic, some called it European, some simply called it beautiful. It was all of those things. But more importantly, it was distinctly, unmistakably Studebaker. Then came 1950 and the bullet nose. The bullet nose Studebaker divided opinion the way genuinely original design always divides opinion, sharply, loudly, and permanently. The front of the car featured a chrome projectile mounted at the center of the hood, flanked by circular headlight housings that gave the vehicle the appearance of something that had been fired rather than driven. Critics called it bizarre. Detractors called it a mistake. The buying public called it irresistible. Studebaker sold 320,000 vehicles in 1950. It was the best sales year in the company's automotive history. Lowy did not stop. In 1953, he produced what many automotive historians still consider the most beautiful American car ever designed. The Studebaker Starliner was a low, long, fastback coupe with a roofline so clean and a silhouette so precisely proportioned that European manufacturers studied it with the uncomfortable attention of people encountering something better than what they themselves had produced. The Museum of Modern Art in New York included it in an exhibition of significant design objects. A car from South Bend, Indiana, displayed alongside paintings and sculpture as a work of art in its own right. This was Studebaker at its absolute peak. Not its peak in sales, the numbers, as always, were constrained by the company's size relative to the Big Three, but its peak in something harder to measure and more important to lose. Studebaker at this moment possessed what no amount of money could simply purchase from a supplier or copy from a competitor. It possessed an identity, a voice, a point of view about what an American automobile should look like that was entirely and unapologetically its own. Workers in the South Bend plant took photographs of the cars they built and kept them at home. Dealers reported customers who had come in intending to buy a Ford or a Chevrolet and left with a Studebaker because they could not stop looking at it. The brand carried a loyalty among its customers that was disproportionate to its market share, the fierce, personal loyalty that people extend not to products but to things they love. That loyalty was about to be tested. The men who would test it were already on their way. Harold Vance and Paul Hoffman did not share blood, but they shared something that bound them more completely than family ever could. They shared Studebaker. They had grown up inside the company, learned its rhythms, absorbed its culture, risen through its ranks during the years when rising through Studebaker's ranks meant something. They were, in every sense that the company's workers and dealers and customers would have recognized, Studebaker men. The kind of men the founding brothers would have understood and approved of. That was precisely the problem. Hoffman had joined Studebaker in 1911 as a parts clerk. He was 20 years old, energetic, naturally persuasive, with the particular gift of making every person he spoke to feel like the most important person in the room. He moved into sales, then into sales management, then into executive leadership with a speed that reflected both his talent and the company's willingness to reward it. By the 1920s, he was one of the most respected automobile executives in the country, not merely within Studebaker but across the industry. His instinct for marketing, for understanding what American consumers wanted and how to reach them, was genuinely exceptional. Vance came up through the engineering and manufacturing side, which gave the partnership a balance that looked, from the outside, like exactly what a company needed at the top. One man who understood how to build cars, one man who understood how to sell them. They became co-chief executives in 1935, guiding Studebaker through the final years of the Depression and into the post-war boom, with a steadiness that earned them genuine admiration inside the industry. For a time, they were the right men. The post-war years were good to American automobile manufacturers in a way that required almost no strategic brilliance to exploit. Soldiers came home from Europe and the Pacific with money saved and nothing to spend it on, and the first thing millions of them wanted was a car. Demand outstripped supply across the entire industry. You did not need to be a visionary to sell automobiles in 1946 and 1947. You needed to have automobiles to sell, and Studebaker had them. But the post-war boom concealed something dangerous inside Studebaker's balance sheets. The company's labor costs were running significantly higher than its competitors. The South Bend workforce had negotiated contracts during the boom years that made sense when sales were strong and margins were healthy. When the market normalized, when the pent-up post-war demand exhausted itself and American consumers became selective again rather than desperate, those labor costs would become a structural problem that no amount of clever marketing could solve. Hoffman and Vance saw the numbers. They understood what the numbers meant, and then they made the first of several decisions that would define their legacy inside the company they had spent their careers building. They did nothing. Not nothing in the sense of paralysis or ignorance. Nothing in the sense of a calculated bet that the good times would continue long enough for the problem to resolve itself, that sales would remain strong enough to absorb the cost differential, that Studebaker's brand loyalty and design advantage would compensate for a manufacturing cost structure that was quietly making the company uncompetitive. It was the kind of bet that intelligent men make when the alternative, confronting a powerful union, renegotiating contracts, restructuring operations that employed thousands of loyal workers in the city where the company had been born, feels politically and personally unbearable. The numbers, meanwhile, kept moving in the wrong direction. By the early 1950s, Studebaker's production cost per vehicle was running nearly $200 higher than comparable models from Ford and General Motors. $200 sounds modest against the scale of an automobile company. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of vehicles per year, it was a wound that bled continuously and quietly, just below the surface of the financial statements, invisible to the dealers and customers and workers who believed, because they had always believed, that Studebaker was fundamentally sound. Hoffman left in 1948 to lead the Economic Cooperation Administration, the agency implementing the Marshall Plan in post-war Europe. The timing of his departure was, depending on your interpretation, either fortunate or convenient. He left Vance holding a company that looked healthy and was not. He left Vance holding a problem neither of them had been willing to fix. And he left Studebaker, without either of them fully understanding it yet, already dying. James Nance believed he was buying a partner. What he was actually buying was a corpse. Nance had arrived at Packard Motor Company in 1952 with the confidence of a man accustomed to turning things around. He had spent years at General Electric's appliance division, building market share through aggressive marketing and relentless operational discipline. Packard, one of America's most storied luxury automobile brands, had hired him to restore a greatness that had been slowly leaking away since the war. He was intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely certain that he understood what Packard needed. What Packard needed, Nance had decided, was volume. A luxury brand could not survive on luxury sales alone in the American market of the 1950s. It needed a mass-market partner, a company with high-volume production capacity that could share engineering costs, manufacturing overhead, and dealer networks. The arrangement would let Packard focus on its premium models while the partner handled the volume end of the market. He looked at the independent automobile manufacturers still standing in 1953 and identified Studebaker as the obvious choice. South Bend had the factories, it had the workforce, it had the dealer network, it had the brand recognition. On paper, Studebaker looked like exactly the kind of established, competent, financially stable company that a merger with Packard could transform into a genuine alternative to the Big Three. On paper, the merger was announced in 1954. Studebaker Packard Corporation came into existence with press releases that described synergies and economies of scale and the creation of a fourth force in American automobile manufacturing. The automotive press covered it with cautious optimism. Industry analysts noted that two struggling independents combining their resources might achieve what neither could accomplish alone. What no one outside the South Bend executive suites fully understood, and what several people inside those suites had been carefully avoiding saying out loud, was the true state of Studebaker's finances. When Packard's accountants arrived in South Bend to conduct the due diligence that should have preceded the merger announcement, what they found made them reach for the telephone. Studebaker was not merely underperforming. It was not merely carrying higher-than-average labor costs. It was operating with a cost structure so fundamentally misaligned with its revenue that the company had been, in any honest accounting, insolvent for years. The labor cost problem that Hoffman and Vance had declined to address had metastasized. Studebaker's workers were producing significantly fewer vehicles per man-hour than workers at Ford or General Motors performing identical tasks. The differential was not marginal. Independent analyses conducted after the merger estimated that Studebaker's South Bend operation was so inefficient that the company lost money on every car it built below a certain sales volume, and it had been selling below that volume for years. The company had survived by drawing down reserves, by accounting maneuvers, by the particular institutional optimism of an organization that had survived the Depression and 2 world wars and believed in its institutional bones that it would survive this too. It had not survived. It had simply not yet finished dying. Nance absorbed this information with the expression of a man who has just been told, after signing the lease, that the building has no foundation. He had options. He could walk away from the merger, absorb the reputational damage, and focus on saving Packard alone. He could restructure Studebaker aggressively, close plants, renegotiate contracts, eliminate the inefficiencies at their source, and accept the short-term pain of a brutal operational overhaul. He chose neither. Instead, Nance proceeded with the merger and attempted to use Packard's resources to stabilize Studebaker's operations while simultaneously developing new models for both brands. It was a strategy that required everything to go right: sales volumes, market timing, labor relations, product development, at a moment when nothing was going right for independent automobile manufacturers anywhere in America. The Big Three had spent the post-war years investing in automation, in new plants, in manufacturing efficiencies that were widening the cost gap between themselves and every independent by the quarter. General Motors alone spent more on capital improvements in 1954 than Studebaker Packard's entire annual revenue. The resources available to Nance were not merely insufficient for the task, they were insufficient by an order of magnitude that made the task itself a fiction. Packard's money, the money Nance had intended to use rebuilding both companies, was consumed by Studebaker's losses within 18 months. By 1956, Packard was dead. The last true Packard automobile rolled off the line in 1956, replaced by a rebadged Studebaker that wore the Packard name like a borrowed suit at a funeral. Nance resigned. The merger that was supposed to create a fourth force in American automotive manufacturing had instead accelerated the destruction of 2 American institutions simultaneously. Studebaker Packard Corporation continued. But Studebaker, the real Studebaker, the one built on 5 brothers and $68 and a century of earned reputation, had just lost its last best chance at salvation. It did not know it yet. It was about to be given hope. Sometimes a dying company gets one last gift. Studebaker got the Lark. It arrived in showrooms in the autumn of 1958, and it arrived at precisely the right moment, which is to say, it arrived at a moment when the American automobile industry had made itself vulnerable in a way it had not been vulnerable in decades. The Big Three had spent the mid-1950s engaged in a size competition that had produced vehicles of almost satirical excess. Cars that were longer, wider, lower, heavier, and more aggressively ornamented with chrome than any functional consideration could justify. Fins had grown to architectural proportions. Wheelbases had expanded until some models required the turning radius of a small ship. The American family car of 1957 and 1958 was, in the estimation of a growing number of American families, too much car, too expensive to buy, too expensive to fuel, too large to park in the driveways of the suburban houses that the post-war boom had built. Into this moment of excess, Studebaker introduced a car that was none of those things. The Lark was compact, sensible, honestly proportioned. It seated 6 adults without apology and fit in a standard parking space without difficulty. Its engine was economical at a time when gasoline prices were beginning to make economy a genuine consideration for middle-class buyers. Its price was competitive. Its reliability, built on mechanical components that Studebaker's engineers had been refining for years, was genuine. It was in almost every respect the right car at the right time. The American public responded with an enthusiasm that Studebaker had not seen since the bullet nose years. In 1959, the company sold 131,000 Larks. After years of sales figures that had required creative interpretation to present optimistically, 131,000 units was a number that needed no interpretation at all. It was unambiguous. It was real. It was the kind of number that made bankers return phone calls, and dealers expand their showroom floors, and workers in South Bend dare to believe that the worst was behind them. For 1 year, Studebaker was not a company in decline. It was a company with momentum. The automotive press, which had been writing Studebaker's obituary in installments since the Packard debacle, reversed course with the particular enthusiasm of people who prefer a resurrection narrative to a tragedy. Feature articles appeared in major publications. The Lark was cited as evidence that the independent manufacturer could still find its footing against the Big Three by being smarter rather than bigger, by reading the market rather than simply following it. Studebaker's new leadership, Harold Churchill had replaced Nance at the top, understood what the Lark represented. It was not merely a successful product, it was a window, a narrow, time-limited window during which the company could use the cash generated by Lark sales to do what had never properly been done: restructure the cost base, modernize the South Bend plant, develop the next generation of products that would keep the momentum alive beyond the initial compact car wave. The window required urgency. It required discipline. It required the kind of decisive, painful operational choices that Hoffman and Vance had declined to make a decade earlier, when the making of them might have saved the company without a crisis to force the issue. What it got instead was hesitation. The Lark's success was real, but it was also fragile, in a way that Studebaker's leadership either did not fully appreciate or chose not to confront. The compact car segment that the Lark had pioneered was not going to remain Studebaker's exclusive territory for long. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were watching the sales figures with the focused attention of organizations that knew how to replicate a successful formula at a scale that no independent could match. The Falcon arrived in 1960. The Corvair arrived in 1960. The Valiant arrived in 1960. 3 companies, 3 compact cars, 3 marketing budgets that individually dwarfed Studebaker's entire annual revenue. The window closed, and Studebaker, which had been given one last chance to save itself, had spent that chance doing almost everything except the one thing that might have worked. The last gift had been wasted. What came next did not decline. What came next was the end. The numbers told the story before anyone in South Bend was willing to say it out loud. The Falcon outsells the Lark in its first year of production. Ford's compact car, backed by a marketing budget that treated Studebaker's entire advertising spend as a rounding error, takes the segment that the Lark had created and claims it with the casual efficiency of a large animal displacing a smaller one from a watering hole. Studebaker's sales begin retreating. Not catastrophically, not yet, but with the steady directional certainty of a tide going out. The retreat continues. Studebaker responds with what struggling companies almost always respond with when they cannot afford to solve their problems properly. They respond with variations, new trim levels, revised styling, option packages designed to create the impression of new products without the expense of actually developing them. The Lark spawns the Cruiser, the Daytona, the Wagonaire, Each variant costs money to develop and market. None of them costs as much as a genuinely new platform would have cost. None of them works as well as a genuinely new platform would have worked. The fundamental problem, the one that went back to Hoffman and Vance and the labor contracts of the post-war boom, had never been fixed. Studebaker was still building cars in South Bend at a cost per unit that made profitability, at the sales volumes the company was now achieving, a mathematical impossibility. Every car that rolled off the line represented not a contribution to the company's survival, but an incremental addition to its deficit. The workforce knew something was wrong. You cannot work inside a manufacturing operation that is slowly suffocating without feeling the suffocation in the air around you. Overtime disappeared. Maintenance budgets were cut. Equipment that needed replacing was repaired instead, and then repaired again, and then held together with the institutional equivalent of wire and optimism. The South Bend plant, which had once been among the most impressive manufacturing facilities in the American Midwest, began showing its age in ways that no amount of good maintenance could have entirely prevented, and that the available maintenance budget made inevitable. Sherwood Egbert arrived as president in 1961 with the energy of a man who had not yet learned that energy alone could not solve a structural problem. He was a salesman by background and temperament, recruited from McCulloch Corporation with a mandate to find the revenue that would buy time for a deeper transformation. He commissioned the Avanti, a dramatic fiberglass-bodied sports car designed by Loewy in a creative sprint that produced something genuinely extraordinary, and he pursued a supercharged version of the Lark with a promotional aggression that temporarily animated the showrooms. The Avanti was beautiful. It was also too expensive to produce, too different from anything in Studebaker's existing lineup to share components efficiently, and too niche in its appeal to generate the volume the company needed. It was exactly the kind of product that a healthy, profitable company with surplus resources might have used to build long-term brand prestige. Studebaker was not that company. Studebaker was a company that needed to sell 100,000 affordable cars to working families, and the Avanti could not be that car no matter how much anyone wished it could. Egbert's health failed in 1963. He had been diagnosed with cancer, and the disease progressed with a speed that removed him from active management at precisely the moment when active management was the only thing that might have altered what was coming. He fought to stay involved. He could not. The presidency passed to Byers Burlingame, a man whose primary qualification for the role appeared to be his willingness to accept it at a moment when most qualified candidates understood what accepting it meant. By mid-1963, Studebaker's South Bend operation was losing money at a rate that had moved beyond the language of corporate finance into something closer to the language of hemorrhage. The board of directors, which had spent years receiving reports that contextualized bad numbers within frameworks of cautious optimism, was finally receiving reports that dispensed with the frameworks entirely. The plant employed approximately 7,000 people. The plant was losing, by some internal estimates, more than $2 million every month it remained open. Arithmetic was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of when. The meeting was held on December 9, 1963, 11 days before Christmas, 11 days before the last Studebaker would roll off the South Bend line, 11 days before 7,000 workers would learn that the company they had built their lives around had decided in a room they were not invited into that their lives were no longer part of the calculation. The board of directors of Studebaker Corporation gathered in that room carrying information that most of the people most affected by it did not have. They knew what the monthly loss figures looked like. They knew what the projections said about the next quarter, the next year, the next 5 years if South Bend continued operating at its current volume and cost structure. They knew that the window the Lark had briefly opened had closed, that the Big Three's compact car offensive had permanently claimed the segment, that no new product in Studebaker's development pipeline was going to change the fundamental mathematics of a plant that cost more to operate than it could ever reasonably be expected to earn. They knew all of this. They had known most of it for longer than the meeting minutes would ever reflect. What they decided in that room on December 9th was not made in haste. It was not made in panic. It was made with the cold, considered deliberateness of men who had been moving toward a conclusion for months and had finally run out of reasons to delay reaching it. The South Bend manufacturing operation would cease. Production would be consolidated at the Hamilton, Ontario plant, which operated with a smaller workforce, a more favorable cost structure, and the additional advantage of being located in a country where the political consequences of closure would be someone else's problem. The vote was not close. What happened next, or more precisely, what did not happen next, is the part of this story that deserves to be examined with the kind of careful, unflinching attention that the board of directors never applied to the human consequences of their decision. The 7,000 workers whose livelihoods depended on the South Bend plant were not informed before the decision was made. They were not consulted. They were not given the opportunity to propose alternatives, to accept wage concessions, to demonstrate the kind of flexibility that workers at other struggling manufacturers had sometimes demonstrated when the alternative was made sufficiently clear. They were told afterward, not immediately afterward. The board's announcement came with the particular cruelty of institutional communication, carefully worded, legally reviewed, stripped of the human language that might have acknowledged what was actually being done to actual people. It landed in South Bend like a verdict delivered without a trial, a sentence imposed without the formality of charges. The union leadership, which had spent years negotiating the contracts that had contributed to the cost structure that had contributed to this moment, received the news with a shock that was either genuine or performed, depending on which account you trust. The workers received it with something that went beyond shock into a register that does not have a clean name. The particular devastation of people who have given the best years of their working lives to something that has just informed them, without apology, that the transaction was always more conditional than they understood. Byers Burlingame, the man holding the presidency at the moment of closure, would later describe the decision as painful but necessary. Necessary is the word that institutions use when they want to present a choice as an inevitability, when they want to remove human agency from a sequence of events that was defined at every critical juncture by human choices. The closure of South Bend was not inevitable. It was the terminal consequence of decisions made and not made across 15 years by men who had been trusted with something they did not protect. Hoffman, who had seen the labor cost problem forming and left. Vance, who had held the problem and done nothing. Nance, who had merged two dying companies and called it a strategy. Churchill, who had squandered the Lark's momentum. Egbert, whose vision outran his resources and whose illness removed him before his energy could be tested against reality. Burlingame, who inherited a situation beyond retrieval and managed its conclusion without grace. No single man killed Studebaker. It took several of them, working across several decades, making their contributions to the outcome in sequence, each one inheriting the consequences of the last, and adding his own. The workers of South Bend did not make those decisions. They built the cars. They showed up. They did what they had always done, what their fathers had done, what the city of South Bend had organized itself around the assumption that they would continue doing. They were the last ones to know it was over. They deserved to be the first. The Hamilton plant lasted until March 1966. It produced Studebakers for 2 years and 3 months after South Bend went silent, turning out vehicles with a diminishing workforce and a diminishing purpose, supplying a dealer network that was itself contracting as dealers concluded, one by one, that carrying a brand with no future was a commitment that their own futures could not support. The last Canadian Studebaker was a cruiser. It rolled off the Hamilton line without ceremony, without press coverage, without the kind of acknowledgement that 114 years of continuous American manufacturing history might reasonably have been thought to deserve. The Studebaker Corporation did not die with its cars. It lived on as a corporate entity, pivoting into defense contracts, into automotive parts, into the kind of diversified industrial holding company that has no identity because it has abandoned the one it was born with. The name survived on letterhead long after it had ceased to mean anything. Eventually, that too faded. The corporation was absorbed, reorganized, dissolved into the anonymous machinery of American conglomerate capitalism, leaving behind no monument, no landmark, no physical evidence that it had ever existed except for the cars themselves. The cars survived. Studebaker owners turned out to be exactly the kind of people the brand had always attracted: stubborn, loyal, and deeply resistant to the idea that something worth keeping should be discarded simply because the institution that made it had failed. Clubs formed. Registries were established. Mechanics who had spent careers working on Studebakers continued working on them, passing their knowledge to apprentices who had never seen a new one on a dealer's lot. The Avanti, that last desperate act of design ambition that Egbert had commissioned in the final years, was purchased by a pair of South Bend dealers who refused to let it disappear. They produced it independently, in small numbers, for decades, a ghost brand haunting the city where the mothership had died. South Bend itself became something that American cities were becoming throughout the 1960s and 1970s with a regularity that should have produced a policy response and largely did not. The factory complex that had employed thousands sat empty. The supplier businesses that had existed to serve it contracted and closed. The neighborhoods that had housed its workers hollowed out with the particular gradual devastation of places that have lost the economic reason for their density. South Bend joined the long inventory of American manufacturing cities that the post-war industrial consensus had built and the post-war industrial collapse had unmade. The Studebaker factory buildings still stand. Some have been repurposed, converted into offices, retail spaces, the mixed-use developments that cities pursue when they are trying to transform an industrial wound into a post-industrial amenity. The Studebaker National Museum occupies part of the old complex, housing the cars and the history and the photographs of the men who built them. Visitors come from across the country to walk through it. Many of them are the children and grandchildren of people who owned Studebakers, who worked at the plant, who grew up in South Bend when South Bend was the kind of city that a company like Studebaker made possible. They stand in front of the Starliner and the Bullet Nose and the Lark, and they understand, without needing anyone to explain it to them, what was lost. Not merely a car company, not merely a brand or a product line or a set of manufacturing assets that could be valued and written down and distributed among creditors. What was lost was a particular kind of American institution, the kind built across generations, carrying a name that meant something to the people who made it and the people who bought it, grounded in a place and a community and a set of values that treated quality and honesty as competitive advantages rather than marketing slogans. Those institutions do not come back. When they are gone, the space they occupied does not fill with something equivalent. It simply remains empty in ways that are difficult to measure and impossible to ignore. Studebaker didn't die because America stopped wanting cars. It died because the men trusted to protect it stopped believing it was worth saving. And the workers of South Bend, who believed in it until the very last shift, who built the very last car with the same hands they had used to build the first one that season, who turned off the machines and walked out into the Indiana winter without anyone in that boardroom having had the decency to look them in the eye, they knew what had been lost better than anyone. They had built it,